Concord Players are putting on a production of She Kills Monsters in Concord, Massachusetts, running from November 7th through the 22nd. She Kills Monsters is a play about a woman coming to terms with tragedy through 2nd edition D&D. It'll tug at your heartstrings and be rad as the nine hells. For more information and to purchase tickets, check out their website at concordplayers.org. Welcome to the Game Master's Book Club, where great fiction becomes your next great role-playing experience. This episode, 3 new Game Masters take up the quest of the GM's Book Club with the first book of the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series, The Lightning Thief by Riordan, George Krubski, Marshall Smith, and Eric Driks accept the challenge of bringing Percy, Abigail, Grover, as well as all of the Olympian gods to your gaming table. Let's get into the conversation. Hi everybody, welcome to the Game Masters Book Club. I am Eric Jackson, I am your host, and I am here to introduce you to 3 new Game Masters. This is great. Welcome everybody. How's it going? Yay!
Yay!
Hey. Fantastic. All right, so I'm going to have each of these wonderful people tell you something about themselves, and then they have a deep philosophical question to answer before we get started, one of religious importance. Everybody here is going to talk about their favorite mythological deity before we get started talking about all of the deities that are present in Percy Jackson's The Lightning Thief and the Percy Jackson Olympians series. So I think we're going to start with George. George, would you want to introduce yourself to everybody and tell them what your general gaming background is and who is your favorite in-game deity?
Sure. My name's George Krubski. I've been gaming since the 70s, I think. It might be a little unusual in that I skipped over D&D pretty quickly and went into sci-fi and superheroes almost immediately. I played D&D, but I spend most of my time when I'm running games, it's sci-fi. In the old days, superheroes, pulp fiction, pulp stuff. There you go. I've run at least 2 decade-long campaigns and a lot of other shorter stuff as well.
Fantastic. And your favorite deity?
It's tough to pick a favorite deity, so I like a lot of the Middle Eastern stuff. I'm interested in like the Shanema, the Persian Book of Kings. Gilgamesh, I guess, is a hero rather than a deity, but I think the Middle Eastern stuff's pretty cool.
Awesome. Marshall, would you like to go next?
Sure, absolutely. So I've been gaming since Redbox D&D, the best Christmas present I ever received. And I have a few different things as far as Geek Trade go. I've got a couple of publishing credits, a couple of playtest credits, mostly for things that came out of AEG.
Not to interrupt, Marshall, but what is AEG?
Oh, Alderac Entertainment Group. So I wrote for 7th Sea, the first edition. I did short story for Warlord of the Accord Lands. I did playtesting for Spycraft after it left AEG, and did some writing and playtesting for Edge of Midnight, done by Rob Vox, which again, after he left AEG.
Fantastic. And your favorite deity?
I think I'm going to have to go with Morrigan. Both the actual goddess as worshipped by the Celts, and she gets some really fantastic representations in a lot of different fictional books. The Iron Druid, Dresden Files, etc.
Great. Fantastic. Eric, your turn now.
Aw, thanks. And thanks for having me here. Yeah, so my name's Eric. I'm from the Philadelphia area. Been gaming a while, from Dungeons and Dragons to Palladium to a variety of different hero games, Cthulhu. Had my hands playing in a lot of things, literature writing degree, first time delving into Percy Jackson. So excited about it.
All right. And your favorite deity, Eric?
So gonna have to go with Hercules. Hercules, just because very much has a lot of faults. As far as gods go, ruled by passions, makes mistakes, is just very human and understanding more of the human condition, and then gains that godly power in the end of his journey.
Fantastic. And I am Eric Jackson. I'm the host and obviously the least qualified person who is in here, having no degrees or credits whatsoever. However, my favorite deity is Hermes. I like him for the same reason that I like Odysseus, in that I like a clever god. Actually, any trickster god would do, but I've been thinking about Hermes since we've been listening to Percy Jackson, which is where we're going to pick up next. This book follows Percy Jackson and his journey to understand his divine origin. This book talks about Percy Jackson and his relationship to his god father Poseidon. He meets up with a group of other god children at a camp called Camp Half-Blood, and from there he gets two great friends, Annabeth Chase, who is also a godchild of Athena, and Grover Underwood, who is a satyr, and they have a whole questing thing that's going on with them, which I think is really interesting in the book. And they take themselves on a quest. It's very specifically referred to as that. And on that quest, they go to stop a war with the gods. I don't think they really finish that in the first book. And obviously, there are movies that have been based around this book, and there is a TV series that's currently running on Disney Plus. So this is a very, very, very popular book. So does anybody have anything they want to add about this book before we start talking about what we'd want to do with this in a tabletop?
There's a play as well. There's a musical.
Okay, great. Eric?
Yeah, I was just going to say, for a setting and background, it has such great themes in it. Themes of the fantastic existing in the edge of society, the use of destiny, that whole notion of found family versus family, and some darker themes also running through it that, even though it's sort of a young adult book, is really pulls you in.
Marshall?
It also does have some really interesting themes about whether or not you need to do what your parents expect you to do. Just because you have a destiny, do you have to follow that destiny? That gets much more in the later books, but even the first book has some of that.
George, anything additional?
No, I mean, I think that it's, maybe worth mentioning that it's clearly from the young adult crop that followed the success of Harry Potter. I mean, Rick Riordan was writing I believe well before Harry Potter came out, but Percy would not exist without Harry, and it's a better series, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't disagree. I also just want to mention that now that we've talked about Rick Riordan, that it's been specified in a number of articles that he wrote this book specifically for his son, Hallie, who has ADHD and dyslexia, which of course is something that also Percy has. And I think it gives really good representation for people who are neurodivergent. So folks, let's start with Marshall first, and let's start talking about how we could take this exceptional series and turn it into a fantastic tabletop role-playing game. Marshall?
So one of the things that you really want to focus on is a lot more of the narrative drives rather than a lot of the mechanical drivers on this, because a lot of what the various characters do stems from inner fire, their inner drives, and their connections to their immortal parent, rather than just I trained and therefore I'm good with the sword. They get a lot of their abilities just handed to them, but they have to be worthy of them. I would really be looking for a much more narrative game system to use to do for this.
And do you have one that you think would work well?
So one of the first things that came to mind is Kids on Bikes, which is a very narrative system. Some of our listeners may know it better as Kids on Brooms, which was featured on Dimension 20. Also, Never Stop Blowing Up. They turned it into an 80s action movie thing. I found out while researching for this that they have just published a system called Never Stop Questing, which is based on that system. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet because it literally just dropped. But Kids with Bikes is a great system, very narrative, very focused around young kids doing interesting things. So I think that it would be a great fit for this.
That's fantastic. Yay, new games coming out. George, how about you give it a shot and tell us how you would run this game?
I agree with a lot of what Marshall said. I think that it's very narrative heavy game. Like, combat in the Percy Jackson books is not really fought so much as solved. So a traditional RPG is not going to be a good match for it. I will note, as I said earlier, I skipped over D&D to a lot of other games, and I've spent most of the 21st century running 2 10-year campaigns. So a lot of my gaming references are older. I'd definitely be interested in checking out some of the stuff that Marshall recommended. Games that came to mind for me are the some of the Margaret Weiss games that are sort of more narratively based or a little looser. One of the things I really like, we've got a game based on the TV show Leverage. You have skills, but mostly it's based on your role. But I think it would be a little too difficult here because there's so many different gods. So you couldn't have okay, we're going to make a Poseidon roll now. We're going to make a Zeus roll now. I think something loose like that would be nice. One of the older games that occurred to me was the old Wizards of the Coast Marvel RPG. Within the Percy Jackson universe, there's definitely these things scale up. You've got the demigods, you've got the gods, you've got the titans. Unless they've got some trick, a demigod rather, is going to have a lot of trouble against someone at a higher level. Even within the demigods, there's a scale where the children of the big three are sort of more powerful. The big three are Poseidon, Zeus, and Hades. They're more powerful than the children of the other Olympians, who are more powerful than the children of the lesser gods. So something that scales up, I think. But obviously, you have to compensate in some way, or everyone wants to play one of the kids of the big three. Structurally, I think the series does a great job of setting up guidelines for what an RPG would be like. There's definite rules for why the kids can't go to the cops and why the kids can't go to the teachers to fix their problems, which is one of the ways in which I think it's much better than Harry Potter. Among the three main characters, yes, it is Percy's series. Percy's name is on the cover, but Annabeth and Grover both have their own very clear and very different motivations than Percy. I think it's a great setup for a small group of narratively based players.
All right, fantastic. Eric, what did you have in mind for our Percy tabletop game?
So regardless of system, my first approach was going to be a session 0 with the players. I mean, if you know your players really well, you'll have a good idea that they'll fit into this. There's a lot of themes in there, especially if you don't know your players. Violence, bullying, drug and alcohol abuse was sort of hinted at in some ways. Different beliefs around Eurocentric and disabilities and things like that. But just to engage your players to get on the same footing, I think is really important. System-wise, D&D I think could be a great fit, but I was leaning more towards a cousin to D&D, which is Mutants and Masterminds, which is a D20 system based on the 5th edition rule set. And it's a very hero-based system, but they've already done some of the lifting. They have a supplement called Claremont Academy, which is their high school setting for young heroes. And their power level system plays really nicely into that demigod, god, titan level where, hey, you're just starting out. Maybe you're a PL6. You don't have a lot of points. Your powers are going to be lower, and you can earn those points and develop your abilities as you go and train. The other is the Unisystem Lite, which is used in the Buffy Angel game system, which I find just a really fun system. Very theme and role-playing oriented for that.
All right, fantastic. I definitely agree with you on the D&D part. I think that is the standard item, no matter how we all might feel about Dungeons and Dragons. But it does have a specific book out right now called Mythic Odysseys of Theros, which runs on this whole idea of you playing heroes. So if D&D is all your people are comfortable with, then I think that's a great place to go. But I also agree with George that I don't think this is supposed to be a combat-heavy game based on the book because, as you said, combat is solved, not fought. For that, I found two different games, one of which was called Godbound. And Godbound is a very dark version of this. So if you are the kind of person who wants to make Percy Jackson gritty for some reason, that would be the game for you. But I think the game that most closely matches it for me is a role-playing game called Agon, A-G-O-N. It's a very quick play-based system. It has one roll resolution, like George was mentioning earlier. It has great mechanics for things like when you generate your character, you have an epithet, and it also talks about lineage, which is going to bring us to those big three. And then we have other items like divine favor. You can activate pathos, which this book does in abundance. There's a whole scoring system that's based on bringing, straight from the book, quote, glory of their name. So I think Agon is a great quick play version of this. I haven't had a chance to run that game, so I can't speak to how great its mechanics are, but they did read really well. If I were going to run Percy Jackson, that's the system I would try it in, unless I couldn't get anybody interested in a new role-playing game, which, let's be honest, is 90% of the time when you're trying to get a group of gamers together, in which case I would be like, okay, let's play D&D and we'll go Mythic Odysseys of Theros, and I'll get to run my game that way, even though it might not be perfect.
And hey, if you do D&D, there's a first edition Deities and Demigods book. You can still find PDFs to view online, which has a lot of great little snippets of information on multiple pantheons.
That is absolutely true, which is a great lead-in to our next topic, which is going to be what are the things we were talking about, stealing stuff from older versions. So now we could talk about stealing stuff from Percy Jackson. That is, of course, the primary function of every game master, and that is I will steal from all of the media that I have ever read or watched, and I will put it in my game somehow. And is the basis of this entire podcast. Actually, I'm going to be rude and I'm going to take the first one because I just want to say that I really like Camp Half-Blood. I love a good school book in any version. Percy Jackson doesn't spend a ton of time on the school. It's there and it's very active and it has very specific rules, but that's my favorite part. And even though things like Strixhaven, which is a D&D book, which is, again, a little bit more Harry Potter-y, has some structure for something like this, I do think Camp Half-Blood would be something I'd want to put in a world where I had Children of Gods. And I will pass the baton on to Marshall next.
Great. On that note, just before I take the rest of it, there is another RPG that I found called Camp Myth.
Ooh.
Which I wouldn't recommend in general, but it is specifically a light RPG for running Camp Half-Blood. So there's no journey, there's no quest beyond it, but if you want to go earn merit badges at camp, that's what it's all set up for.
Oh, fantastic.
One of the things that I loved about the Percy Jackson books was the mist, especially from a game master perspective. You see this sort of thing in a lot of these urban fantasy kind of books of, hey, muggles just don't notice, or, people on the Hellmouth just rationalize away the vampire. I feel like Rick Riordan just took it to another level with the mist, because not only does it explain why the mythological creatures and the magical happenings don't get reported, but the interactions between the mist and the main characters and the NPCs, it was really interesting in a number of places where the rubber hit the road on that. Just watching people as the mist took over their perceptions, or as they came out of the mist and they saw, oh my God, that really is a monster. So I really liked what he did with the mist.
All right. Fantastic. I agree. I think it's a really great way of dealing with that. And that could be used in almost any game that you're running that has a paranormal aspect, monster of the week, or like a Buffy the Vampire Slayer kind of game, or anything where that happens. That explanation is very useful. Eric, do you want to talk about stuff you'd like to take from Percy Jackson next?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of great ideas in there. I also love Camp Half-Blood, and one of my advices to GMs is when you're running games, it's not just about the quests and the dungeons and the dragons, to put a statement in there, but it's about the competitions, the social interactions. I think it was mentioned in the other system, like merit badges, just great ways to make players feel successful and challenge them in different ways. There's obviously, without giving anything away, there's interactions that Percy Jackson has in the camp that are both good and bad. There's competitions they have, that some of which they describe, some of which they just allude to. I think my players, some of the most fun they've had is when I was running non-adventure situations where they had to keep maybe taking part in a fair where there was a pig chasing competition and they had to capture it, or just little fun things like that lets players do their thing, but not in a lethal combat sort of way. Really, when I heard that, I was like, oh, that's a fun thing to do at Camp Half-Blood, or whatever school game system you would be looking for.
Great. George?
As I alluded to before, I think there's a great structure for a campaign in the Percy Jackson world, in that you've got the mist, which explains why you can't just go to the cops. The gods don't want to be interfered with, which is why the teachers don't get involved. So you sort of sidestep that. Why don't they just go ask the Avengers for help question? There's also, as Eric, I think you alluded to, the quest model. So there's ways to sort of let if you're running a campaign, you can sort of let the players hang out and relax and learn and evolve. And then when it's time, you just shove a quest on them and they're out in the world. We can do that in any game, but here it's built right into the narrative. It makes much more sense than sorry to knock Harry Potter, which I do love. The fact that something crazy happens every year in Harry Potter is arbitrary. Here it's built into the narrative of the quests, the dealing with the gods. One thing that we haven't really talked about that I think would be interesting. When the book starts, Percy does not know who his divine parent is. Obviously, a lot of the other characters do know, but I think whatever system one were to use, you'd want to be able to incorporate in some way reflecting the mystery of maybe some of the characters know, maybe some of the players know who their characters are descended from, and some of them are going to learn in-game, which could add a fun dichotomy to the game as well.
I wanted to bring up one more thing, and again, I'm bringing this up, and it's actually part of the role-playing part, but one of the things that I liked about Percy Jackson piece is that some things were on a clock. They felt very time pressured.
Yes.
And for that, Blades in the Dark has some really great systems. It's mostly designed for heists because you have a certain amount of time, but you could modify some of that clock material in order to give you that feeling of the approaching solstice or whatever time limit you're giving your quest. You wouldn't necessarily even need to run it in Blades in the Dark, but you could steal that clock system, which is that you have a clock as the players and you as the game master have a clock. And if there are successes, the character's clock moves forward. If there are failures, then the game master's clock moves forward, and whoever finishes first, wins, kind of a thing there. So that's a great piece to help make that feeling, which takes place a lot in the first book for sure, this idea of extreme time pressure and having to get things done within a certain amount of time. That could be a great way to reflect that concept, which I would also like to take from that book.
First, I think we see it in this book, but it definitely is very apparent as the series progresses. A lot of times the characters think they have a clock, and that clock changes dramatically in response to circumstances. So there's definitely instances where, if you're using the Blades in the Dark model, where they lose like 3 slices off the clock before they even realize what's happening, which adds a lot of good pressure, a lot of unpredictability to the series. I don't know what Riordan's background is, but definitely I think applies a lot of screenwriting techniques to the story, and some of them are basic elements that any game can use to its benefit. Obviously, anytime there's time pressure, if people have all the time in the world, they're just going to grind up, get all the resources they can, and complete the quest, finish the mission, whatever. So I agree with you. I think that the clocks are great. And I think the whole idea of why can't they just go to the adult? Now, if you see a movie and you get to the end and you're like, why didn't they just go to the police? That's probably not a good movie. But once there's a reason for them to not go to the police and they're on their own, much better movie, and that's what Riordan has done.
All right. Does anyone have other things that they'd like to steal from Percy Jackson at this point?
I did explore the concept when I was thinking about running a game in this world. I thought you can actually run it from 2 different points of view. You can run it as the kids that are, getting these destinies and these quests. Would it be interesting also to say, all right, you were Half-Blood campers. You are now adults in this world looking after these kids, or you are now working as an adult. What happened, the end result of these characters growing up. The adventure doesn't have to stop. The mission just changes.
Eric, you may want to keep reading the series. Because as it progresses, they do kind of deal with the fact that, hey, we're getting a college level and after. What does that mean?
Right.
Which is very interesting, and it shifts the dynamic quite a bit.
Absolutely. I am planning on continuing.
Oh, yeah. I would also recommend, at least as far as games are concerned, there is a game called Changeling, which is out of the White Wolf group. And one of the things about it is that it has levels of folks who are involved in the magic world. And there are wildlings, which are like the kids. And then there are, I forget what the middle one is. And then there are grumps, which are the older people who have been around for a really long time. So that might be something, if, again, maybe not the best system to run this in, but you might find some inspiration in it.
That sounds great.
And of course, White Wolf also has Scion, which is intended to be you are playing a demigod.
Oh, well, there we go.
But it is a much more adult focused game, and I don't feel like it would be appropriate for Percy Jackson per se. But if you wanted to play adults who are dealing with a lot of these kind of things, that might be something to look at.
Well, if I may, I think you bring up an interesting concept. Percy Jackson is almost sort of straight down the middle, high fantasy, if you will. It's sort of the Lord of the Rings or Star Wars of this type of world. But you can see very easily how there could be either a ridiculous Douglas Adams-esque version, or let's just imagine an alternate version of Percy Jackson where they run into the Pantheon of Cthulhu, and that's going to be horrifying.
I was just going to say the temperature, how harsh the world is, whether it's a light and fun world versus a dark and gritty world, can almost be seen as the whole balance of the Greek mythology. You have everything from Disney's Hercules. These gods are sort of these funny little fun guys who get their hair blown out, to you have some really dark themes in some of the old mythological tales and some of the stories that have come out. So you could, either way you lean, it's a great setting. It's a great potential for a campaign setting.
Even within Percy Jackson, there's pretty clear implication. If you don't make it to Camp Half-Blood, it's a very different life.
Oh, yeah. There's a lot of adult themes in there, which I think plays to the statement that, teenagers these days are not immune. Many times they're tried to be protected, but really it's some of these darker things out in our world are out there, and you can't shield people 100% regardless of how much you try. Ooh, that was a downer.
There's at least two parents on here, so I can appreciate where mythologizing and fictionalizing the terrible things that can happen to kids is a good way to then use games like this to discuss the real things that are happening in the world with our children, which I guess brings me to a quick side question. And I don't know the answer to this. George and Eric, do you game with your kids?
I do. I gamed with my kids when they were little, starting them off on Cape and the Borderlands with their first module, and them being really little and trying to climb over the wall and escape, which they didn't have to do. But they're in their 20s now, and I still game with them when I can.
Awesome. George?
For me, board gaming, but not RPGing. We did read both the Harry Potter and Percy Jackson series, as well as a couple other ones. And I'm talking into when she was like 14. I was still reading books to her in the car. So.
That's awesome. Marshall, are you with me in the no kids camp?
I am, in fact.
Excellent there. But George does talk about reading books and books that would be related to this. I think we've covered HP pretty well, but I'd like to go on and ask Eric, could you lead us off on media and or books that you thought would be inspiring like Percy Jackson?
The Magician series, both the TV and the books, I think plays heavily, again, slightly aged up, but you still get a lot of those similar themes, much more focused on magic, but there's still gods and there's mythological creatures, and there's a lot of fun interpretations of what magic means in the world. On the other side of it, you have things like Buffy or Supernatural, even Dresden Files, which is all that like supernatural on the outskirts, just beyond your normal vision.
Great. Fantastic. Marshall, would you like to go next?
Sure. When we're talking about gods walking among men, my mind immediately goes to American Gods, a book that I've read many times. And it is obviously much more adult themed than Percy Jackson, but wrestles with a lot of the same questions around destiny, around the interplay between human free will and the will of the divine. And I think that you could play with a lot of very similar elements.
George?
Well, I mean, if you like the theme, if you want variations on the theme of Percy Jackson, you don't need to look much further than Rick Riordan himself. He has done the Percy Jackson series, goes between Greek and Roman. I think there's 14 or 15 books now. He's done Egyptian, where the characters are not descendants of the gods, but are the avatars of the gods. He's done a Norse series where they're soldiers for Valhalla. In fact, one of them is Annabeth's cousin. I know he's done a Celtic short story. I haven't read that one. He's got an imprint called Riordan Presents, where they do probably a dozen different myths. I know it's Hindu, Aztec, Korean, Caribbean, Navajo, Chinese, and a bunch of others that I'm forgetting. I wanted to add something besides Rick Riordan direct, so I started thinking about what were some of the series that we read. There's a series of books called Fablehaven by Brandon Mull that it's a series of nature preserves across the globe where supernatural creatures exist. And someone is trying to take them all out, which, again, would be a pretty good RPG.
Agreed. Absolutely. I'll wrap it up here and talk about my favorites. If you wanted to do a school book and you didn't want to do HP, I would recommend Naomi Novik's Scholomance series. The first book is called A Deadly Education. We were all talking about changing the theme from lighter to dark. If you wanted to run a much darker version with Cthulhu-like beings involved, that's the book. It absolutely is fantastic. Giant creatures called more mouths devour people whole, but they never actually kill them, and they live inside their stomachs forever. It's horrid, but it's great. It's a fantastic series, and I have a personal low tolerance for horror. That book is great. I cannot say enough about Naomi Novik's A Deadly Education. I would also, along the lines of the Destined Questy one person, recommend In Other Lands by Sarah Reese Brennan. It's a little bit more of a portal fantasy, less of a being in our world thing. So although there is some back and forth between that, so in that regard, it could be really good. And then the last one I thought of is just a classic of fantasy. People get together and they're destined to move forward and they have powerful parents. I would go with anything by Tamora Pierce. All of her YA stuff is amazing. Nice. Starting with Alana, the first adventure from the Song of the Linus series. She literally has, I think, like 5 different young adult series with kids with powers who go on cool things. But that's all in a fantasy world, not within our world. So in that regard, it's another half step away from Percy Jackson. I think, again, the Deadly Education by Naomi Novik is the best match.
Sounds fantastic.
All right, so that brings us to wrapping this up here. I've had a wonderful time talking with you folks. If you would like to, again, say who you are, and if you've got any projects out there, if you want people to follow along, or anything that you're supporting or doing out in the world. George, why don't you start?
Sure. I think it was about 2 years ago, I worked on the 10-year anniversary edition of the Firefly board game. It's based on Joss Whedon's TV show. If you like the game, if you like the show, if you like gaming, check it out. It was a Game Found campaign, so you'd have to get the whole thing, probably from a gaming store, but it's definitely a very fun game. If you want to talk about it, find me on BoardGameGeek.com on Firefly the game page. I also want to do a shout out for my friend Will Padilla. He does an 80s themed podcast called 1980s Now. They talk a lot about the significance and the nostalgia of the 80s, but they also do these sort of, they call it true crime, but it's really just weird true stories from the 80s. And I've done a couple scripts for them. I'm working on one coming up soon that, depending on, Eric, when this episode drops, that may already be out.
Oh, it probably will be, given the rate at which I edit things. Yes,
that's fair. So I'm doing one for it's going to be based on a real life treasure hunt, late 70s, early 80s, and another one that I did a while back was on the Atari Sword Quest games. It was a good episode.
Yeah. Extra shout out to Will. When I started working on this podcast back last year, he was the main guy I spoke to on how do you do a podcast? He was he's been a rock of support. And theoretically, at some point, he said either A, I could come on his podcast, or B, we could get him on here. So we'll see if we can't get Will to show up and do a little discussion with us at some point in the future. Over to you, Marshall.
I want to shout out to my friends over at Crafty Games. I became friends with them doing Spycraft back in the day. They've largely moved over to board games, including a great board game based on Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series. They have just opened up their Amazon shop, so ask people to go check them out.
Fantastic. Eric, give us your shout outs.
All right. So my shout outs, as previously mentioned, our main character this podcast is Percy Jackson, who's a bit neurodivergent. And I just wanted to bring some attention to gameonphilly.org, which you can, learn more about at gameonphilly.org. And I just encourage you to visit the site, volunteer, donate if you can. It's an organization that seeks to share the benefits of role-playing games to people in the Philadelphia area, especially the economically disadvantaged and neurodiverse. So great organization. If you have time, take a look.
All right. I can only say that I'm super happy that you guys, we gotten together. This is our first recording together. So thank you so much for doing the book club with me. It's always great to have new people on. And you guys brought really great energy and really fresh ideas. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's a great group. I learned a lot, so I appreciate it.
Thanks, Eric.
And that's our discussion of The Lightning Thief, the first book in the Percy Jackson and the Olympian series by Rick Riordan. You can find a complete transcript of today's discussion, as well as links to all of our podcasts at k-squareproductions.com/GMBC. You can learn about upcoming episodes on our social media on Blue Sky at gmbookclub.bluesky.social, on Facebook at Game Masters Book Club, and on Instagram at Game Masters Book Club. You've been listening to the Game Masters Book Club, brought to you by me, Eric Jackson, and K-Square Productions. Thanks again to our demigod-like GMs, George Krubski, Marshall Smith, and Eric Driks. Look for them to return when the book club covers Dungeon Crawler Carl by Matt Dinniman. Continued praise and thanks to John Corbett for the podcast artwork and Otis Galloway for our music. Later, gamers, and to paraphrase the great Terry Pratchett, always try to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape.